The Russia-Ukraine conflict has reverberated through Asia as it has through Europe. Historic alliances have been tested and national policies redirected to an extent that could reshape Asia's geopolitical relations for decades to come. Traditional alliances and economic links have mostly driven the response. Interestingly, about a third of the nations that abstained from UN vote to condemn Russia, seen here in yellow, were clustered in this region. Heavyweights India and China both willing to wear condemnation from the West for remaining neutral. Neither country has joined the sanctions bandwagon. In fact, the two have become the world's largest buyers of Russian oil. India also buys more weapons from Russia than any other country, a sharp point of contention with its Western allies at groupings like the G20 and the Quad. A similar conundrum confronts Southeast Asia. Russia has historically been a major supplier of weapons to Vietnam, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Indonesia. But that trend, is declining, with more countries in the region now choosing to bolster their own arms manufacturing capabilities. Analysts say the Ukraine war has been an accelerant. And as Asia rearms itself, geopolitical flashpoints in the region have come into sharp focus. Many quick to draw parallels between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a possible future invasion of Taiwan by China. The West's massive support of Ukraine more than a veiled warning to Beijing should it choose to move on Taipei. That warning driven home by NATO, which has vowed to boost ties with Asia in the face of regional threats. The U.S. appetite for a larger footprint in the Indo-Pacific also in no small part fueled by concerns about spillover from the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
For more on this, James Crabtree joins us live. He's here in Singapore. He is Executive Director at IISS-Asia. Good evening, James. It's been nearly a year into Russia's war with Ukraine. It continues to have diplomatic consequences here in Asia. It has also seen a shift in the strategic mindset of the United States and also its EU allies over the security position in this region. And that's even despite the US stated pivot to the Indo-Pacific. What to you, though, are the worrying ramifications for Asia of that shift?
I think you summed it up quite well in your introduction. Partly, there are a couple of countries who are involved directly. So Australia, New Zealand, Japan, to some degree, the Republic of Korea have been supporting Ukraine. But I think more generally around the region, you have threat perceptions rising. So as countries looked at what happened in Ukraine and thought, well, we didn't think that could really happen now, but actually it's happening. So we need to be more worried about what might happen in our own region. So, for instance, countries would be more worried about conflict between China and the United States over Taiwan. So I think there's a heightened nervousness. People are looking more to spend more on defense as a result of that, even for those countries that aren't involved in the war directly.
There is that sense that the war in Ukraine perhaps has deepened the potential for conflicts in this region. You mentioned the issue of China and Taiwan. It has arguably signaled this shift towards a new phase for China's intentions, perhaps with Taiwan. At the Munich Security Conference recently, the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg repeated what the Japanese Prime Minister had said last year and what others have said. What is happening in Europe today could happen in Asia, he said. Now, China has seen in real terms, though, how the war has hurt Russia as well, its economy, its military, as well as its reputation. Have any of these warnings moved the needle at all for security in Asia and what that may or what may or may not happen in the Taiwan Strait?
I think people are worried about this. You mentioned Prime Minister Kishida, who in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year said that the risk is that Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow. And he was most likely thinking about the risk of China in that sentence. However, I think there is another side to this, which is nobody really knows what China is going to do with respect to Taiwan, but there's a good reason to think that the misadventure of Russia, its military failure and its failure to achieve its strategic objectives, may actually make Chinese planners think twice about any military adventure that they may be thinking of in Taiwan. So it's a little hard to draw definite conclusions as to how Ukraine will factor into the thinking of some actors in this region.
Nonetheless, we have seen heightened and more dangerous military activity by China in the Taiwan Strait, where the United States is concerned as far as security in the South China Sea is concerned, also being watched carefully because of that proposed pivot to Asia, now seen to be somewhat dampened. That is, of course, to China's advantage. But to what extent has Beijing successfully leveraged the duration that this war has played out, nearly a year now, in order to limit America's influence in this region?
That's a very good question. I think so. You have two different things going on here. One is that Russia and China have drawn closer together as a consequence of the war. China, I don't think, really is very happy with what Russia has done, but it felt that in the end it had to support it to some degree, not militarily, but in terms of the UN votes. The US is in a different position. Actually, the war has been somewhat positive for the US in the sense that its reputation has been enhanced. It's been able to marshal its allies. It's been able to provide high-tech weaponry, and Ukraine has done pretty well. And so far, at least, it hasn't stopped the US from moving forward with attempts, for instance, to move more military equipment into Asia. However, it is clear that Ukraine is a big drain on military resources and the attention of American leadership. So I think that tension will get stronger for the US the longer the war goes on, as in the more it has to support Ukraine in terms of weapons and the limited attention of its leadership, the harder it will be for the US also to really focus on what it needs to do to balance China in this part of the world.
And at the same time, the United States has needed its friends and allies insofar as the Ukraine war is concerned and this push against Russia to stop this war, Japan being one of them. The war has accelerated Japan's defense posture. It is also part of those efforts to isolate Russia with sanctions economically and so on. How central, though, and cemented perhaps, James, is Japan's role now to building this structure of peace, perhaps, to prevent regional ambitions and hostilities from escalating in the Asia-Pacific?
But I think you used the right word, accelerated. I mean, Japan was already on a path to spend more on its military, and that was really nothing to do with Ukraine. That's all to do with how anxious the Japanese feel about China's military buildup and the way that China behaves. But I think Ukraine added an extra dimension to that, as Prime Minister Kishida said at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is just that, there's more nervousness about the nature of the stability of the security order. So yes, Japan is an essential player in all of this. If there's a war over Taiwan, then Japan will get drawn into it. Japan is beginning to move beyond its post-war heritage as a predominantly pacifist country by spending more on its military. And so Japan, as part of the group of US countries that are trying to balance China, it's really Japan, the United States, and Australia, which are the core countries at the heart of that.
A big question looms for Asia in the meantime, James, on how this war will ultimately end. If it does indeed end. China's top diplomat Wang Yi, his trip to Moscow has been billed as this mission to find a peaceful solution to the war there. It's also been suggested that India's prime minister could be part of perhaps a brokered peace process, Turkey even. Do either of these two Asian powerhouses, India and China, really have a role as peacemaker in Ukraine? And if they do, what could it be?
I think at the moment it is hard to say. China has not played this role before, and we haven't yet seen what Wang Yi has to offer. He's talked about this plan at the Munich Security Conference, but we haven't really seen any details. Presently, I think it's fair to say that at neither side of the Russia-Ukraine war, experts at the IISS would assess, has the upper hand and is likely to gain the upper hand. And so what I think the Western countries are trying to do is to help Ukraine in order to give them a better position in a future negotiation. They don't really believe that Ukraine is going to be able to win a brilliant military victory in which they, kick the Russians out of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So I think some kind of negotiated peace is going to be necessary, but really ultimately that has to be negotiated between Russia and the United States and Ukraine, and these other players, including the two Asian countries, are going to only play a small part, if any, in achieving that goal.
James, thank you. James Crabtree, Executive Director at IISS-Asia, speaking to us live from here in Singapore.